We are back for another Awana lesson, and today I want to share with you about the life of Paul Brand. He came to my mind just early on when we started talking about having to shut down Awana and have this isolation time where we're trying to protect ourselves from this virus, because Paul Brand knows all about that. He grew up in India, and he was a missionary kid, and his dad was actually a builder, but he had to do an awful lot of medical things just because he knew more than the people in India at the time and could help. So he did, and there were some really gruesome things that Paul experienced as a boy growing up that he saw his dad do, and I'm gonna share a couple of the really gross things because I think Sparks just kind of like hearing that kind of stuff, right? So if you're not one of those kids that likes hearing the gross stories, just cover up your ears for a little bit, okay? Because I'm going to tell two stories about Paul growing up and what he saw his dad do. The first one was that they had these guinea worms, and guinea worms would be in the person's body under the skin, and you couldn't just pull them out because they would break, and then the part of the worm that was still in the body would get all infected and gross. And so his dad had to take a knife, and he would cut kind of where he felt the worm. He would cut and fish out the tail of the worm and affix it to a stick. And then he'd just take a little bit out, take the stick on, send the person home. And then he'd come back the next day, and he'd do the same thing. He'd take just a little bit more out because he couldn't pull the whole worm out. So this might take several days or weeks, depending on how long the worm was, before they could get it out. Paul thought that was so disgusting. But he understood why, because one day they were walking along a road, and there was a man who had this really swollen leg, and his dad knew that it was an infected guinea worm. And so he had to not only cut the leg to get the worm out, but he had to squeeze all of the junk and pus and grossness out of the guy's leg, and it filled up a bucket. And Paul knew from this point on, he never, ever wanted to be a doctor. That was just so disgusting, and it was so, he just couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand that he had to help with it. I doubt that it was real fun for his dad either, but his dad knew that it would help this person, so he was willing to do it. Well, like often is the case when we say we're never going to do something, when Paul grew up, he actually became a doctor. He studied and became a doctor. And he married a woman who'd grown up as a missionary in South Africa. She wanted to go back to South Africa. He wanted to go back to India. So they agreed that they would just go wherever the Lord called them first. So if Paul got called to India first, they'd go there. If she got called to South Africa first, they'd go there. So off they went to India, because wouldn't you know it, he got called first. So he's a doctor in India. And he also recalled a time when he was a kid. And this is going to be what the main part of our story is. There was this disease in India, and it was totally frightening. You've heard about it if you've read your Bible. It was leprosy. We call it Hanson's disease now. It still exists, but we know how to treat it now, in large part because of this man. So if you recall in the Bible, whenever someone had leprosy, they had to live in a colony outside of where everyone else lived because it was contagious. They had to isolate themselves. If they ever came into the city, they had to yell, "Unclean, unclean," so people could get out of the way. They didn't know how it was transmitted, but it was contagious. But not everybody got it. And we didn't understand for a very long time, again, not really until Paul Brand, how it was transmitted. But one of the really terrible things about leprosy was and is that the people would eventually lose their fingers and their toes. Their hands would be deformed. So it was a really scary disease that people didn't understand. So Paul, in his work in India, let me read this one paragraph to you from this book. It says, like an annoying stone in his shoe, Paul could not ignore the mystery of leprosy. Somebody had to solve the riddle of what was happening to the hands of leprosy sufferers and why. eventually Paul came to the conclusion that this was the reason God had put him in Vellore in India, to be the person who took on the task of helping leprosy patients keep or regain the use of their hands. So he did all kinds of things. He did a lot of really meticulous research. He thought outside of the box in so many ways. He was able to figure out that the deformations of their hands and feet weren't actually because of the active process of the disease. We know now that Hanson's disease is a bacteria. Most of us are immune to it. Most of the world's population is immune, but a few of us are susceptible to this bacteria, and it attacks the nerves. And there are certain places on the body where it kills the nerve. And so the people eventually kill off the bacteria and they're better, or they get antibiotics now and they're better. But the problem is that when it kills the nerve, it kills their sensation and they can no longer feel pain. So a lot of Paul Brand's work is about how pain is a good thing. For instance, if you went to the stove and you touched the stovetop and it had just been turned off and was still hot, you would instantly jerk your hand back, right? Because you'd feel pain. So pain would keep you from just putting your hand there and having your flesh be damaged, right? So Paul learned that because they had this nerve damage, they didn't feel pain, and that's what was deforming their hands and feet. They'd get a blister and not know it, or they'd be hammering and not realize that they just hit their thumb. Or one of the grosser stories was he was measuring these people's hands in a kind of a leper colony, and he would measure how much finger they had left. And one day a man came and he had less finger. And so Paul said, what happened? And the man had no idea what happened. He had no recollection. He knew that he was supposed to be recording anytime he hurt himself because he couldn't feel it, but he had no idea. And Dr. Brand figured out that there were actually rats that were going into the leper colony's homes and eating on them at night. And they didn't wake up because they didn't feel it. So that's what had happened to his finger. And as gross as that is to think about, nobody had figured that out before. So he did other things too. He developed shoes that were better for the lepers' feet so that they wouldn't rub blisters. He taught them how to hold the nail with a pair of pliers so that when they hit with a hammer, they wouldn't hurt their fingers. He did all kinds of little things, just living amongst them and figuring those things out. So he was a hero, and he totally changed the way we think about disease process and active disease versus the side effects of disease that happen afterwards. He obviously changed the people's lives that he was working with, as he taught them new ways to do it, as he taught people in India that these people were no longer contagious, that they could be treated medically and be okay. But the thing I'd like to focus on now is this idea that pain had a purpose. And Paul Brand and Philip Yancey wrote at least 2 books on the idea of pain being a blessing. We think of pain and we just think of it as being something evil. But without pain, we would hurt ourselves all the time, like these leprosy patients did. And I've been thinking about that. You know, we can have physical pain, like touching the stovetop and burning ourselves. And we can have emotional pain, somebody saying something mean to us. Disappointment is emotional pain. Some of you might be disappointed right now that you're not going to school, or that you're not getting out of your house like you'd want to be, or that you're not seeing your friends. You're not going to Awana. So there's 2 kinds of pain. There's physical pain and there's emotional pain. But what I would like you to think about is in both instances, there's a purpose for the pain. Now, there's a verse that I want to share with you, and it's a little bit confusing. So I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it doesn't mean, and a little bit about what it does mean. Okay, so we're talking about pain. Let me put this verse up here, see if you can see it. It says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So he's talking about, this is in James. James is talking about, this idea that when we have trials, another word for pain, emotional or physical pain, that there's a purpose behind it. Now, the confusing part is at that very beginning when it says consider it joy, pure joy when you have pain. Let me tell you, that does not mean that you have to go, woohoo, I just burnt my hand on the stove. That was awesome. Okay, that would be false. That would be a lie. He's not asking us to lie. What he's doing is saying to look beyond that. Not that the painful part was happy, but that there's purpose behind it. That God will use our pain, our suffering, our trials for our good. Doesn't mean that we have to be happy that we're having them. But we can be happy that God is going to use them in our lives. And it tells us exactly what God uses them for. It talks about this word perseverance, kind of a steadfastness and stick-to-itiveness. You're going to get back up and do it again, right? And then it says that we would be mature and complete. Mature and complete, not lacking anything. That's the purpose behind the trial, is that we would become more mature. When I think of mature, I think of the spiritual gifts, like being, or not spiritual gifts, but fruits of the Spirit, like being self-controlled, being loving, being kind, being gentle. Those are the things that grow in us when we're mature, those fruits. So God can use trials to bring those fruits into us. There's another verse, let me put it up here for you, that says from 1 Peter 4:19, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while continuing to do good. So there's two keys in here. One, we have to know that God is faithful, that He created us, and He's faithful to us, that He's not going to abandon us, that He's not going to just leave us in the trial and say, good luck, hope you make it. He's going to be right there with us, helping us through it. And the other thing is the word entrust. We have a choice when we're in a hard time. We can trust God, or we can tell God He doesn't know what He's doing. And God's big enough. If that's how we feel, we can still say that to God, and we can be honest about how we feel. But I want you to get that it's a choice that we make, whether we trust God with our souls, with ourselves. If we trust that He has a purpose for the pain that we're in, does not mean that God gives us the pain, like, take that so you grow up. It's not like that. But He does allow pain. He does allow things to happen to us. Always, always He's in control, and He's allowing only so much. He's only allowing what He wants us to experience. And sometimes that amount is overwhelming to us. Sometimes that's really hard to understand. And it goes back to that entrusting ourselves. We have to decide whether or not we think God is trustworthy. And some of us during this COVID pandemic are really having to face that. Are we going to trust God? Are we going to trust Him that we're missing school? Are we going to trust Him that maybe things are hard? Some of us have parents that are out of work right now. Some of us are fighting with siblings and it's not much fun to be home. There's all kinds of trials. I couldn't possibly guess what all of you guys are going through. But I want you to get this. I want you to understand that this time isn't wasted. The time that you're at home can produce fruit in you. You can grow up a little bit. You can mature. You can be more self-controlled. You can learn to be more gentle. You can learn to be more loving. And if you're not learning that, if you're not thinking about how you can bless your family, if you're not thinking about how you can pray for people, in some ways you're kind of wasting this time. So I want to challenge you, Sparks, to think about next time you get in a fight with a family member, or next time you're maybe just feeling yucky, I want you to think about how you can respond in a more mature way. How can you ask God to help you in this? How can you ask God to help you see it a different way? God is faithful to give us wisdom if we ask Him. It says that in James, that if we ask God, He's faithful to give us wisdom. And He does so without finding fault in us. So just be encouraged that this time that you're at home isn't a waste of time. This time that you're not in school isn't a waste of time. God's doing something in your life. He's doing something in your parents' lives. We may be facing trials, but we're also developing perseverance, and it's going to make us mature and complete as God works and as we entrust ourselves to Him. So I encourage you, again, great series of books. If you have some read aloud time, the one on Paul Brand would be a great one to read right now if you want to order that through the mail. I hope you guys are doing well. I hope that you're studying still and finding lots of good things to read. I hope you're reading your Bibles, and I hope you're doing some sections, some memorization. Don't forget that on the Awana Clubs at Grace page, we have some things to help you memorize Psalm 23 and the New and Old Testaments, as well as having these sessions. So just stick with it, guys. Persevere. Pretty soon you'll be out of your homes and back to Awana. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.